Hi everyone, good to see you again. I'm Alejandro Zambrano. I am also a student in this program and I'm extracted in Bahamas. Welcome to the second event in our fall 2023 lecture series, Just Communities. David Lee is an award-winning architect, planner, and educator who has completed plans and buildings nationwide. Mr. Lee has held faculty positions in the Rhode Island Institute of Design, MIT, and the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Architectural projects completed under consideration include the Standing Hill and Gate Station, the O'Brien African American Northeastern, Only Baptist Church, and the David Center, all in Boston. In 2022, he completed the Clarion, a mixed-use, mixed-income apartment building in Roxbury.
Current projects under his direction include the Villa Conde Tower in Boston's Nubian Square district and the Colonial Village mixed-income townhouses in Norwalk, Connecticut. Under contract with the City of New Orleans, Mr. Lee worked with a group of local and national consultants charged with developing plans for the neighborhoods most impacted by Hurricane Katrina. Mr. Lee led the Citizens Advisory Committee charged with creating a civic vision and guidelines for the strategic development of air rights over the Mass Turnpike. This widely acclaimed effort received a National AIA Honor Award for Urban Design. Mr. Lee served as president of the Boston Society of Architects in 1992. He was the recipient of the BS's Year 2000 Award of Honor. Along with his late business partner and the firm's founder, Donald Stull, FAIA, Mr. Lee was awarded the NOMA 2010 Lifetime Achievement Award.
Trained amid the turmoils of the 1960s and the Vietnam War, David Lee will discuss the challenge he has felt throughout his career to not just strive for strong design and placemaking, but to search for the additional dimensions necessary to make the work socially and politically relevant, especially in the underserved and under-resourced neighborhoods. Often working with limited budgets, Stull and Lee have operated in the premise that the materials don't have to be precious, but the proportions do.
Please give a warm welcome to David Lee, BAC honorary degree recipient of 2011. I please present When 1 + 1 = 3.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Is this going to work this way? No, I mean, yep, this part. Okay, yeah. So you're going to give me a from the beginning, right? There we go. Okay, put this to your column. I think that's the way to go. Okay. Okay, one thing I want to do right away is acknowledge a classmate of mine. He was here a minute ago, David Jakowitz. He must have stepped, oh, there he is back there. David and I went to the Graduate School of Design years ago. I won't tell you how many, but he was a treasured colleague, and I'm so pleased that he came tonight. So a couple of things. I have a bunch of slides, but believe me, I'm not going to go through all of them. And my years when I was teaching at the GSD, I used to always tell my students, you'll have to ask your parents about this, that in the evening news, that if you took out the commercials, Walter Cronkite told you everything that was important that happened in the world today in 22 minutes. So I figured if they could do that, I used to say to my students, you should be able to describe your project in something under than 45 minutes. So there's that. But I love you guys. I'm amazed to see you on time. I always say, architects don't do on time. I always say you can never be late to an architect's office. You can be early, but never late to an architect's office, because we're always trying to make one more drawing or do one more thing before everybody gets here. But over the years, we've always had students from the BAC. You guys come out ready to rock and roll. I value so much your work and your work ethic, because you work all day in some cases, and then you come and you work into the night. And I was saying to Karen that, 10 o'clock at night here is like noon. So, yeah. So it's always fun to be here. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly and then try to leave some room for some discussion here. Okay, it's supposed to move. Didn't go anywhere. I hit this arrow, right? So let's see. Yeah, okay, there we go. All right, our firm has been around for a while. My partner actually started it, my business partner. He started it as Stull Associates in 1966, actually. And we're a pretty broad firm. We've done urban design, and we've done a variety of architecture projects of different kinds. And I'll get into some of that in a minute. But to borrow a phrase, the audacity of hope, right now, I think there are about 2% of the AIA are licensed African-American architects. So you can imagine in 1966, when he started this firm, there weren't very many people around, many African-American architects, much less African-American owned firms. But you know, he went out there anyway, and I am so in awe of him still, and a number of other firms that went out there on their own and made it happen. Followed later by women-owned firms that went out there on their own too. But you got to understand, that was back in the Vietnam War era. And so we were challenging everything. And you can ask your parents or grandparents about that era. It was a pretty tumultuous time. That's actually the bridge over at Harvard, going over between to the B school over there. But architecture, for the most part, was dominated by white males. And in fact, to the point that progressive architecture questioned whether or not it was a white gentleman's profession. So there was a lot to go in terms of making it a broader, more representative expression. But into all of that, Don started the firm, and I was here for graduate school thinking I'd go back to Philadelphia, where I'd worked the last couple of years before coming here. And but we made a real connection. And so when I got here in the summertime, right before starting at the GSD, I worked with then Stull Associates. Some early projects, again, following on this whole challenge. This was Unity Bank, which is now morphed into another bank. I forget what the name of it is right now, but it's the largest American-owned bank in the country. But this was an old automobile dealership that got redone. Don was a real fan of Louis Kahn, so you can kind of see the Louis Kahn influence in a lot of his work. Very, very into geometries. But this was that bank, and it got converted to the garage got converted to that. We actually renovated the Sears Crescent, which was the oldest building, still oldest building on City Hall Plaza. Our first new construction was something called the Harriet Tubman House. And you know you're getting older when you see them rehab stuff that you saw built the first time, or when they take it down and put something else up there. We also worked with a firm called Prelwitz and Solinsky, among others, and the Beacon Companies to renovate South Station. This is a quick side story. There was something called charrette, which I don't know how many of you know much about it. The older heads in here will know, but they had really hip architectural tools and paper and all that kind of stuff. And it was started by a couple of guys at the GSD in the basement of the school, and they got pretty successful. And it was so disruptive with deliveries and all that kind of stuff that the dean called them in and said, "Look, you guys have to make a decision. You're going to be architects or you're going to run a store." They thought about it. They said, "I think we'll run a store." And they ended up hiring their classmates to do their stores. And they also had tickets to the World Series and things like that come with owning a store. So we did some interiors. This was for 60 State Street, IBM. We did a really wonderful project on the North Shore for the Hebrew Rehabilitation Center of America, or something like that. Quick question, story about this one. What you see there, the white panels are kind of mineral fiber panels. And some people in the office were lucky enough to go to, I think it was Brussels, and find out more about this. And we were one of the first firms in the country to use that material. One thing we learned is that you should be the second firm in the country to use a new material. This, I have, here's my cap, my number 42 cap. This is the number for Jackie Robinson, who was the first African-American to play in the modern major leagues. And we did a school down in New Haven that was named for him. And this was that school. And this was back in the days we were doing all the kind of industrial stuff, the crazy colors and everything. But then I came here to study urban design. And so I brought that dimension to the office. And we started doing some urban design projects too. And we ended up working all over the country. This was in Pittsburgh. This was in Kansas City. This was in Houston. This was in Chicago. I'll come back to that one. And then more recently, we've done some master planning for Northeastern. And we've been working with UMass out there and worked with them. And because of our reputation for urban design stuff and some of the people that had come through the GSD, we were asked to come down to New Orleans right after Katrina to help think through how to rebuild Katrina and rebuild those portions of New Orleans. And I don't know if any of you know the commercial where they say, let Mikey try it. But at any rate, we were out of town, so they gave us the lower ninth. They had the whole city. They gave us the lower ninth, which was one of the tougher areas in terms of the amount of damage they had. Long story there. But this is what it looked like when I got down there and took pictures of this. And I said, oh my God, this looks like a hurricane hit this place. And then I said, oh yeah, a hurricane hit this place. But actually, that really wasn't the issue. It was a failure of the infrastructure. What really was the problem in the lower ninth ward was that the levees failed and flooded the area. But that had been an area where African Americans had owned homes there early and so forth. So at any rate, these people were tenacious. They had relocated all over the place. They were in Houston, they were, you name it, but they were still anxious to come back and see their neighborhoods rebuilt. At least a lot of them were. So there were a lot of sessions down there to work with the community. And our role really was to try to help figure out how to rework and rebuild the neighborhood such that give them a plan that could then go for federal funding and so forth. So we helped to identify where investments should be made. And the truth is that there were some issues in the lower ninth ward before the storm, but this gave us an opportunity to kind of rethink some of the ways in which it was built and to create open space and new building typologies, et cetera. And a lot of times, part of the way we work is we use something called photo analogs. You know, if you're doing architecture, people can pretty much relate to a living room or a kitchen or a dining room or something like that. But when you start talking urban design, you're talking street walls and open space and all of that. It's a little more abstract. So part of what we try to do is use photo examples of some of the ideas that we have in mind. And then the other thing is, it's really important to listen to people and to try and interpret what they, what their vision is or what they'd like to see in their community. My grandmother used to always say, if you didn't care where you were going, any road would do. So you have to have a vision. You have to have an idea. As you guys are studying, you got to come up with a concept. It may not be the first thing that happens in the morning. It may not be the last thing that happens in the day, but somewhere in there, you got to find an idea and a place to start. Plato once said that the begin was more than half the whole. I told a philosophy teacher that once when I was late with a paper, and she said, well, you should have started earlier. So that one didn't go. But in the midst of all of this planning, we were coming up on the first year anniversary of when the storm hit. And this local council person said that Lowe's and some other people were willing to provide some materials and stuff. And could we come up with some kind of a commemoration of the events that happened there? So I thought about it and said, and we also had about 6 weeks to do it in terms of approvals and everything else. So I gave it some thought and I came back to Boston. And I literally riding on the green line, sketched out a basic concept. And essentially, just looking at New Orleans, what you're seeing on the top shots are actually where houses had just been washed off their foundations. And sometimes there's just only a fence left. But New Orleans was also a stoop culture. And so a lot of people sat out on their stoops and, interacted with their neighbors and so forth. So we started thinking about those things. There were people who were determined to come back no matter what. And so we followed that spirit too. And so what we did was we came up with this concept for a monument. And these are sort of the major pieces of it. What happened was the poles that you see there just at the top represent how high the water got up to 13 feet. The framing was representative of the people's determination to come back and to rebuild in their neighborhoods. And of course, you see the two chairs where people on the stoop there. And then the chairs at the bottom with the blue chair represents that one person who didn't make it or wasn't coming back. And that was it. It was actually the first physical thing built in the Lower Ninth Ward after the storms. Some notable architectural projects, some you may recognize. This was the Roxbury Community College. This was the Boston Police Headquarters, is. This is the Roxbury Post Office. This is Morning Star Baptist Church, which has become a very important sort of place of record for the African-American community. Whenever there's an important event or something happens, many times people will meet there, and anybody running for office has to go there as well. We've done several transit stations, including some in New York, but this is Savin Hill. And then because of our work, well, let me, this is a little bit backwards, but because of work we did on the Southwest Corridor, which I will talk about in a minute, we were asked to be part of the coordinating architectural and urban design team for the Central Artery. And so in that role, we designed, from an urban design standpoint, we worked on a lot of the interface of the architecture, engineering, and landscape architecture. And then we also did the schematic design for Bent Building number 7, which was also a national AIA award winner. So we did the conceptual stuff. VHB followed it up. Another kind of urban design oriented project we did was in Hartford, Connecticut. It was an area, it was part of the kind of Hope 6 program, which some of you may know about, where a bunch of subsidized housing was torn down in various parts of the country in order to build newer stuff and integrate it into the neighborhoods rather than just having these isolated, generally rundown projects. So one of the things that was important to us was that people not feel isolated, that we find ways to integrate the new stuff into the neighborhood so that people didn't live in building 7, but they actually had an address. I was 736, I don't know, Poplar Street or something like that, to not have people feel like they were in isolation. So we worked with the community to develop a plan that broke down the super blocks and integrated the revitalized area into the adjacent neighborhood. And so this was some of what was the state of the art kind of rendering stuff. You guys are way beyond that with Inkscape and all that kind of stuff. I thought I was being really cool. I told Karen I had a USB thing I'd bring over today. And she said, yeah, we don't do that, right? So I had to get one of my guys doodle whatever it was he did. Send it over. So, but the idea then was to, but it's pretty representative. So this is sort of examples of some of the work we did there. And again, the idea was not just to reorganize the blocks and things, but to also reach to the edges and get involved there. And so this was kind of the vibe when we got there, and this is what that neighborhood's like today. An important project for me while I was still in graduate school was I was asked by then counselor Chuck Turner to if I could help them out that at Northeastern they had an African American institute and they were in a small space, but the university had owned a lot of property around, and one of the things they owned was this former laundry building, and so they asked if they were going to give that to the African American group to make a whole new facility for them. So it was pretty rough shape, but when we got there, I actually, designed all this stuff, and I was sometimes leaving class to go over there and see how, in between classes to see how the construction was going and all of that. But this was also pre-ADA, so I don't think you could get up to that loft any other way. But at any rate, we renovated the whole thing. It became a really important place on the campus for students of color to be able to work together and also to study. And part of the reason the whole thing happened was because a then dean there wanted to make sure that these kids got all the way through school, and they needed a place within the campus to do it. So at some point, as the university continued to grow and moved across the Southwest Corridor, the school decided they wanted to build a new building, but it was a mixed-use building. So it had classrooms, it had dorms, and it had the institute. And the people in the institute were so used to having their own space, they were not happy about being absorbed into another building, and they wanted to maintain their identity and their uniqueness within the building. So part of my charge, we were working with Bill Ron's office, and part of my charge was, as we conceptualized the whole building from a massing site organization standpoint, to then also focus in and try to give some kind of identity to the African American Institute within it. So one of the things I needed to do was try to figure out, okay, how can we take that portion of the building and give it some special kind of feel? So I did a lot of little hand sketches, but I also did some research, and I found this screen from Ethiopian architecture, and I was intrigued by some of the geometries there. And so what I did was I started doing some sketches based on that, and that then led to this particular expression. So when you look at the building, that portion there is the portion that represents this institute. And so you can see the overall massing of the building, and then you can see where the institute is within that. The other thing was, in the old building, they had this mural in one of the conference rooms, and people just had very fond memories of their time there and being in school there and so forth. So what we did was we had that artist recreate that photograph at mural size, and so that became a very important part of the new institute. We also, with a firm called TLCR, Todd Lee's firm, did Orchard Garden School over in Roxbury. It was one of the first new schools built in Boston in about 25 years. And so that's that one. We also did some work with a firm called Community Development Corporation called Urban Edge. There's a whole story to that, but because I have so many slides, I'm not going to tell that whole story. We've done some interiors work here and there. This was for a business school professor at Harvard and his wife, who was an art historian, and they lived in a building. I'm trying to think, right off Memorial Drive. I mean, it wasn't terrible, but I mean, this was the apartment that of the person who sold it, and it was nice, but they hadn't done a lot with it since the time it was built. And so what we did was we kind of rethought the whole thing and made some big changes. So again, that was there. Again, I won't get into it, but where that opening is, for example, was small gestures sometimes make a big difference. And by repositioning that opening, rather than having two equal spaces, we made one space much larger than the other, which allowed you to have a dining area, but then because that was shifted probably about 4 feet or 5 feet, that allowed us to make a more commodious living area as well. And then they had a few ducats, so you can imagine they've got a lacy teapot there, and most of that stuff is very high-end stuff. Then another, we did this for an actual friend. She's a gourmet cook, and she had young grandchildren that she wanted to get into cooking. And she had this perfectly nice galley kitchen across from the monument in Charlestown. But it wasn't a place where she could really, bring the kids into the whole idea. So they had this deck on the side, and literally they're across from the monument. So the historic people were very engaged too. But they had this deck that was big enough for a grill and some chairs, but it wasn't that much used. So what we did was we actually filled in that portion of the deck in order to be able to expand the kitchen. And so it still maintains its overall look across from the monument, and the historic people were there. So about the right half of this slide is what was put in. That window in the narrow part was what the previous kitchen was. And now this is the bigger kitchen where it's the family place. It's where everybody gathers, and the cooking and stuff goes on. Some projects were really transformative. The major one, I think, is the Southwest Corridor project. And I'll talk about this twice, but what you guys probably don't know is that there had been a plan to build this huge expressway right through the heart of Jamaica Plain and Roxbury, and pieces of it swinging around even through the South End. And the community was not having it. There's, because they started clearing space for this thing. It was going to be major. If you guys know where Wentworth is, it's just up there at the top of that slide. And so the community really fought back. And again, this was the era of a lot of political activism and stuff like that. Don't underestimate your power to change things. And community came together across the various boundaries. And this was at a time when Boston was really rife with racial strife and division. But there were people from all neighborhoods coming together and unifying around this issue. And they were smart too. They knew how to handle the media and to get to their public, to their representatives and so forth. So we were asked to be part of the coordinating architecture and urban design group. And so we were working directly with the engineers, and our role, we met, oh God, I can't tell you how many meetings. I mean, just thousands of meetings actually over the time this all happened, because it happened over a number of years. But one of the things that we did, I think, which was a very important thing that I had to kind of get across to people that made the difference, or made a lot of the difference, and that was to get everyone to understand that this was not a transportation project. This was a community development project with a transportation component. And if you change the lens through how you see stuff, then you come up with different kinds of solutions. So for example, if the engineer said, you can only have a certain radius of these tracks in order to maintain, 70 miles an hour or something like that. But if you're trying to save a stand of row houses or some open space, you said, well, maybe it has to go 60 miles an hour, and that radius has to be sharper in order to make that happen. But that's because the lens wasn't about maximizing engineering, it was about a sensible community development approach. But this was what was happening. They had started a lot of the building before this finished, and all of that would have been highway. So part of our role was to work with the various communities to try and work through what their different goals and objectives were. We set guidelines for how the parcels would be developed. And ultimately, we designed a couple of the buildings as part of this parcel 18 portion of it. And so we did the station, the garage, and this office building. We are also responsible for all of the system-wide elements on the platforms, the design of the canopies, the accessibility, and I always choke up when I tell this story. I may do it this time too, but I was giving a talk to some like 7th graders or 6th graders in Brookline, and I was telling them about how all the platforms were made ADA accessible and so forth, and how we didn't want to have people just because they were physically challenged have to go way around to the back to get into the thing. So we designed it in such a way that everybody could go up and down in the same general area. So the stairs are there, the elevators are there, all together. And so I told these students about the time that I was on the train, and there was a guy in a wheelchair, and we got to, I think it was Mass Avenue stop or something like that, and he rolled off the chair, rolled into the elevator, and went about his business. And when I said that, these little students, these 6th graders clapped. And, you know, that sensitivity in those kids, again, I can't tell that one without choking up. But there we go. And there's a whole other story about this, what's called interlock grading, the material on the side of the wall there. But essentially, I mean, those were models and the guidelines, and then that's what we did. One of the other pieces of that was in the south end portion of this, the tracks were covered over, which meant they had to have ventilation shafts. And these were big things that needed to be about the size of a row house. And they had to extend above the adjacent roofs by at least 10 feet. So that was sort of the criteria. So what we did was, and so you can see like the big fans that pull it out and the air go up. And this is sort of where it was located on that particular street. So these were some sketches. This was done by a colleague of mine, a guy named Elmo Ortiz. And then this is the thing. You won a bunch of awards. But if you know row houses, there's sort of an A-B rhythm to them. You got a bow and a flat, bow and a flat. So what we did, if you look at it, is in that last one we went A-B-A. And then the horizontal bands replicate where the windows were. And then you can have fun at all of this. So to the right there, you'll see an orange line that goes up to the top. And then the other thing was a huge project. Don Stull was the architect for this, but Ruggles Station, a fantastic station, one of the largest on the line. But another thing that came out of this was once the highway was stopped, they had this land they had to figure out what to do with, and some of it was in a very linear kind of fashion. So I came up with the idea, well, you know, you had the Olmsted necklace, maybe I can do the Olmsted strand or something like that. So I looked at, so those circles sort of represent important places within the communities along its length. And so this is literally the diagram that led to the Southwest Corridor Park. And you could see where the T stations were and where we were looking to how to connect some of the important places in the community there. And so we had lots of meetings with the community. Again, community was involved in everything. You know, Boston, you work in Boston, you're going to hear from folks, that's for sure. But we worked carefully. And again, one of the things was you had these tracks which were now going to have rapid transit going through there as well, and they were going to be coming pretty regularly. And the community wanted to have some kind of a cover to make sure that the sound was muffled and all of that. Whole long story there too. Next trip, I'll tell you about that one. But at any rate, this was kind of what it looked like then. And then after a lot of work and discussion and back and forth with the community, this is that same spot now, or very close to it. And every once in a while, I'll ride down there on my bike. And when we were doing this, there were a couple of streets where or at least one street where they said, we're not so sure we want to have this park that comes from Roxbury and Jamaica Plain come into our newly gentrifying South End St. Paul Street area. So there was at least one street where they wanted kind of a chain link fence and lock access, so you couldn't get access off and on there at that point. So several years later, I was riding my bike down there and I rode past that place and they had taken the chain link fence and rolled it back so that you could get back and forth. So I figured, yeah, maybe we did something right there. Now, I bet you every single person in this room remembers their first address and their first telephone number. Mine was 531 East 34th Street, and my telephone number was Livingston 89060. They used to have words at the beginning of your numbers. I have known that for so many years. But I bet you if I ask any one of you, you know what your first address and telephone number was. But at any rate, when I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and it was really a lovely neighborhood in many, many respects. And then in the 60s, they started coming in with this public housing stuff. It's part of a whole political thing that happened. And they started building these big towers and stuff. And it was kind of a mess. And then a lot of really fine buildings went away. It was terrible. So I had a chance to go back there and work with a couple of developers to rethink this neighborhood where some of the original public housing was torn down, and they were going to try to figure out how to take better advantage of its proximity to downtown, the lake, and other kinds of things. So we helped them develop a plan, help them think about what, look at density and think about, towers and whatever. And for me, an ideal project is to start at the urban design level and then have an opportunity to pick a spot or two within it. So one of the things we got to do was to design that building that's kind of in salmon color there. And these were just some of the early studies for that building. And there it is. And on the first two levels, there's a hospital, and then offices above that, and then mixed income housing above. And I had an elderly aunt, I still have her for a little while at least, an elderly aunt who actually used that clinic. And of course, she was so proud to show her doctors that her nephew had designed the building. And so this is that. Some recently completed projects. They mentioned the Clarion. That took years, again, because of all the community back and forth and then trying to get the funding for it and all of that. Again, it's mixed income housing, and it has, well, it was going to be retail space, but we got fortunate, and there's this wonderful program. Can't think of the exact name of it right now. Why can't I? But Future Chefs, which is a program that engages young people and gets them into the restaurant services and cooking and all that kind of stuff. So they take part of the space, and then the owners, the developers have their offices there, and then there's some community space there as well. And so this is that building. And then another one we did recently, which has become a very important place. In fact, I fell asleep on a football game one afternoon and woke up, and they were the mayor or somebody was in this building. And I said, "Oh, well, that's cool." And so this is the DeWitt Center. It's a community center for the Madison Park Development Corporation, and they have IT space in there. They've got gyms. They've got health stuff. They've got office space for their management company, all in this particular building. And they also use the spaces for art, for rotating art exhibits and stuff like that. So art is very present in the building. This is the IT place where you go ask your grandchild to show you how to make your laptop work. So this is part of that space. And again, these are, some of the art and things that are there. The gym, which also serves as a major meeting space. And then another recent project was we did this with, again, VHB engineers. And that was, they've now made a stop at Ruggles for the commuter rail line now. And so we were charged with helping to develop a canopy system for that. And so on the boards, on the boards, you guys have no idea what that is. Let me see, on the screen or something like that. But I actually saw a person in here with a T-square. I don't know where she is, but I saw her. I know you're in here somewhere. And that's amazing. I didn't know you guys even knew what T-squares were, but that's great. But some of the stuff we're working on right now, we're working on master plan for a portion of Franklin Park to deal with some of the kinds of abuse and homelessness and other kinds of issues, part of what you're seeing at Mass and Cass. This one is going to be like the Southwest Quarter again. I'm going to be in some very hot and heavy meetings because for a lot of reasons, there are people who don't want to see that. But, you know, every single one of us in this room knows somebody who's struggling one way or another. And we have to engage them. You know, people saying everybody's in the not in my backyard kind of thing. Well, that can't happen. So we're working with several with a landscape firm and several other architects to parcel out the site and how it might work and how the different pieces would happen. We're also working with Mass General Hospital. There's a kind of a mid-modern office building that they have agreed to turn a portion of it over to some community organizations to all come together. They had this entrance to an old boys club, I guess, or the old community center that was their neighborhood center. And they want to, they literally have packaged up all these things and shrink wrapped them. And they told us we needed to find a way to bring those back in. So what you see there actually is that restructured and a new entrance to that space using that. And then this is just part of what that's going to be like. Another thing that we're working on and may or may not happen. This is the Rio Grande Tower in the Nubian Square. This is another project that we're in the midst of right now, which is going to be a mixed use housing and artist spaces and all that kind of stuff. It's really going to be kind of cool out in Upham's Corner. And there's an old Art Deco kind of a bank building that's going to be reused for part of that space. So this is, I'm getting near the end. So these are tools and techniques. Now, you guys, well, first place, based on my granddaughter, you guys had more platforms to communicate with than anyone in history. But do you respond to a text or an email? Forget about it, right? So I appreciate the fact that with digital stuff, you can study things in a very interesting way. You can kind of get a feel for what they may ultimately look like. And you guys are really clever with all this kind of stuff. And it moves so fast. Every time I think I'm hip with like Inkscape or something, you guys are on to something else. But it does help, and particularly it helps lay people to understand where they're going and what something might look like. So I get that. But on the other hand, don't sleep on the simple hand sketch or diagram. And I know your instructors tell you this. It focuses the mind, really. You know, I used to always say when I was teaching back in the day before all this computer stuff was there, I said, look, a student's willingness to reconsider his or her work is in direct proportion to how much time it took them to draw it. So if in fact you spend hours and days drawing a particular thing, the last thing you need 12 hours before studio reviews is for your instructor to come in and say, hey, did you ever think about, I don't want to hear this, right? Kind of thing. But when you make a drawing by hand, you're not going to be able to push a button and do several more of them. So you really think about it in terms of what's going on. So again, don't be afraid to sometimes just subtract. And not that this lecture would prove it, but someone once said, any fool can add. It takes genius to subtract. And obviously, I wasn't able to subtract enough slides, But the fact is, sometimes by just getting down to the roots, and particularly when you're dealing with urban design, you're not going to design 500 buildings, right? But you are going to set the frame for how those things will work. So again, and you can help people visualize stuff and what the implications are of different policies as well. So this had to do with the Northeastern Master Planning and the implications if they were confined in terms of where they could build and they had to build a certain amount of stuff. This gives you an idea of the scale that would be. So that was a very useful diagram. And sometimes, again, it's just a simple sketch that then can get further developed, but you got to think it through. And again, sometimes just a simple drawing will help you get there. Now, you guys can do all the fancy stuff, but don't forget this was actually a sketch for the Northeastern thing. And then there's the cardboard model. There are actually such things as real models, right? Not well, I can't change this line because the model won't allow me. You guys control the model. Don't let the model control you. Now, some food for thought. As I mentioned before, there's still only about 2%, maybe 5% African-American architects in the country. And but now women are stepping up, so they're doing well. Asian Pacific persons are still only about 13%, and Hispanic and Latinos 9%, and African American Black at 2.8%. So that's something we got to deal with, and we have to find ways to make our profession more representative. And there are a whole lot of reasons why it's not, and that's another discussion. But remember this has to do with anything you're facing. What James Baldwin said here is, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. We have to be honest with ourselves about that. And there's a lot of talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, and all of that. First place, and the bottom line is the more diverse companies, it's been proven, do better financially. So it's not just you're just trying to be a good person, but it's a smart move in many cases. But a person said this, and I've kept this in my portfolio for a long time. Diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. The other thing we have to address is the culture of architecture, and the emphasis is on cult. The whole idea of the studio review and how painful that can be sometimes, especially if you get some juror in there who's trying to show off or whatever, and they're talking about what they're interested in and not what you're interested in. And also, driving ourselves to almost distraction by not getting enough sleep. It's never going to change. We're all going to stay up later. I used to say to someone, in undergraduate school, I stayed up all night to get it done. In graduate school, I stayed up all night to get it better. So, but we're going to do that. Except for, I was the first person at Harvard to do this back in the day. Was I used to make my students hand me their work by 10 o'clock the night before review, and I would roll those things up and lock them in my office. So they had to get some sleep. The trick we used to play was we would stay up all night, but then we'd go home, shower, put on fresh clothes, and come try to pretend like we had a nice sleep. That didn't last, but it was a good start. But now, since you guys are you're printing and on the computer like way into the night, it's hard. You can't do that anymore. But it's very painful as an instructor to see a student who's worked so hard on her work all semester. It's beautiful, but she's so wiped out, or he's so wiped out, that they can't adequately defend what were really logical and good decisions that got them to where they are. And of course, there are easier professions, but I don't think many of us do this for the money. It'd be nice to make some money at it, but that's not why you guys do it. And I'm sure that day in, day night, you're always thinking about architecture, and it's just part of it. I was on the fabled Green Line one day on my way home, and it was like a Thursday, and there were some students sitting in front, and they were trying to figure out what to do for the weekend. I said to myself, there are no architects in that group. Because not only do they know what they should be doing for the weekend, they know what you should be doing for the weekend. But there's stress comes with it. Now here's the other thing, guys. I know, yeah, we're all trying to make a greener planet and all that kind of stuff, and we're still trying to figure out how that works into form, into architecture. And we have all these whiz-bang computer programs and everything. But and I'm gonna go out on a limb here, but just because you can do something, you know, yeah. I'm sorry, but there are places where you can go wild. It's just fine, but not. There are other places where you have to be respective of the context, and this doesn't quite get it for me. So finally, the reward. I got like 1 minute left. So here's the reward. This diagram turns into something that's real and loved by people who live along it. I had a person tell me that this was a place that when she was a teenager that she went when she needed to sort things out. The other thing is it's now recognized as a compliment to the Olmsted chain. So if something you drew gets connected in some ways with Frederick Law Olmsted, that's pretty good. And it is a space that people really enjoy and gather in and so forth. And then finally, I was out one day taking pictures of the Orchard Garden School that we worked on. And these two little girls said, "Hey, wait, we want to be in the picture. This is our school." That's the kind of thing that's why we do this. And then finally, people ask, what's your favorite project? And this is always my answer. Thank you.